Hmm. Okay. A little, might be a little dark in here at why it looks bright when I set it up and it says auto light detection's not working. So another technical issue. And I just deleted some stuff from my phone because I ran out of space. So back in business here. So what I was talking about was this idea that Hume says all you can prove is you have certain sensations and they seem related a certain way, or you have certain perceptions, certain ideas, uh, and you really can't use logic and reason to prove anything about an external world of matter, about cause and effect, or about the nature of the world you're experiencing. All you can say is, I'm having these experiences. And you can't even say anything about the you, which is experiencing the world. All you can say about that is that it seems to be just made up of a bunch of more perceptions. So it's all perceptions. It's, or another way of saying it, ideas and the relations of ideas. So that's all there is. And but then Hume starts talking about custom, and it says, for example, it's impossible for you to disregard custom. And natural instincts kick in no matter what you do. You can't argue your way out of custom or nature. And you have all these beliefs in spite of your best efforts to get rid of them. So then it sounds like nature or custom is making you do certain things, and that it's impossible for you not to do things. And it sounds like he's presupposing a kind of cause and effect. Think about the copying relationship between impressions and ideas. It seems that he's saying that when you have that impressions or that the ideas are copies of impressions. It seems like he's saying that impressions cause the ideas, or that ideas are brought into being by the impressions, or that the mind creates impressions. So even though Hume disavows cause and effect, he seems to kind of assume that when he talks about things being copied, one thing leading to another, not be able to shake your beliefs, all those things seem to assume a kind of cause and effect. And the whole idea of nature and custom seem to assume a material world picture, a human nature based in biology, and so on. So again, even though Hume says there's no real world, or there's no material world, there's no cause and effect, there are no minds, perhaps what he's saying is that, well, if you just stick with what you can prove, i.e. be a philosopher, that's what you got to say, because empiricism is the correct theory of knowledge, and if we follow it to its logical conclusion, we got to junk all these beliefs. And so Hume, who is thoroughly committed to empiricism, is going to say, stick with empiricism, and if that doesn't fit with common sense, so much the worse for common sense. Locke, on the other hand, just for contrast, is very common sense, and has these sort of pseudo-rationalist ideas, like this idea of substance, and is unwilling to make nonsense of common sense. He wants to say that the sort of a dualistic idea we have of a material world and then of the mind and mental representations of that is perfectly okay. But he only takes empiricism so far. And even though he says, generally we should use the senses, he still also has some sort of a priori principles. And Berkeley has fewer, and Hume even fewer still. And so Hume, the most extreme empiricist, ends up in complete skepticism. And so one answer to that might be, well, So much the worse for common sense, so much for knowledge. Let's embrace skepticism because that's the only, that's where we're going to end up if we're going to be rational and critical about things, i.e. be empiricists. But another approach might be to say, well, maybe there's something wrong with empiricism. And that's the approach which Kant will have, which we'll talk about next. Just to recap some of the criticisms of Hume, he seems to kind of assume cause and effect in his discussion of the relations of ideas, associations of ideas being copied from impressions, of his concept of nature and custom. They seem to kind of assume a material world, and that that goes against what he says, which is that, well, what material world? We can't prove it, therefore it doesn't exist. And I think Hume would say you can't say something exists which you don't have any proof for. That's not being rational or logical. But he still has this sort of idea that, well, it's kind of absurd to think about there just being ideas without the ideas existing in anything. He recognizes the absurdity. It's just that he is willing to embrace the absurdity in following empiricism to the end, and in what he says being logical and rational, which is in his mind following empiricism to its logical extreme. And you might say, well, I'm just being consistent. I'm being a consistent empiricist. Locke isn't. Berkeley isn't. Locke's concept of material substance is an a priori posit based on what makes sense and and trying to avoid absurdity. Berkeley's got God, which also is not empiricist, which is not verifiable according to empiricist principles, and has this kind of willing or mental causation, which also can't be verified through experience. And so Hume takes empiricism really seriously, ends up with a view which is very different from common sense. So empiricism and common sense don't really go together, because if you take empiricism seriously, you end up with a view like Hume's. And as we'll see later with Kant, he kind of dials back the empiricism, and although he has a general empiricist view, he steers this middle course between rationalism and empiricism. Let's see. I think there's more on Hume. Just go over the study questions real fast here. How does Hume define perceptions, impressions, and ideas? Well, that's should be fairly simple. Perception is any mental phenomena. Impressions are the vivid, lively ones which sort of force themselves on you, and ideas are faint copies of impressions used in thinking. Things like memory, imagination are ideas. Concepts, those are all ideas. What's Hume's test for whether an idea ought to be accepted? And that's this question, from what impression is a supposed idea derived? So you need either an individual impression or a series of impressions from which the idea or concept is copied. And if you can't find those, then you have to get rid of the idea because it's nonsense. What three components of cause effect does Hume identify? Which of these can be verified through experience? Again, just the first two, priority in time and contiguity can be verified, but necessary connection can't. You can't observe necessity. According to Hume, what accounts for our belief in the reality of cause and effect, even if it cannot be proved through experience? And again, that's nature or custom, psychological conditioning, caused by, caused, right? Brought about, brought about by nature or custom, in that whenever we see A and B and A and B and A and B, we see A and we say B is going to happen. So that's psychological conditioning. Now, how do you have conditioning without cause and effect? That's the kind of weird thing. But Hume says it's just an association of ideas. And nature or custom causes us to have these beliefs. So it gets kind of weird here, and perhaps Hume's being contradictory here. What's Hume's view on the existence of the self, mind, or person? Again, there's no such thing as a soul, and the mind is just a bundle of perceptions, which is another way of saying the mind doesn't exist. It's just a conventional term for a series of perceptions associated in a certain way. And that way is that they all seem to exist in the same, locus of consciousness, or we might say they're the sort of the me bundle versus the you bundle, and they can't be mixed and matched. And then with Dave, I'd like you to talk about some of these questions for discussion. Don't you think that you know the sun will rise tomorrow? And is it just guessing? Hume seems to say that seeing something happen over and over and over again it's not proof, you're just guessing. You're guessing it's going to be the same, but you have no rational proof, and that it's no more certain that it's going to be that way than it's not. Because in order to prove something, you need a logical, rational argument, and experience is inefficient to establish that a event must happen. And Hume says if you're just dealing with probability, if you say it's probably going to happen, you're just guessing. You're not really giving a rational reason. So you could argue about that. Is there any inconsistency in Hume's doctrines of the association of ideas and his skepticism about cause and effect? Well, I talked about that, right? Hume uses association of ideas for kind of mental causation, even though he says he doesn't believe in mental causation, and has this concept which seems to operate like cause and effect to explain things. But it's just, ideas are associated or related in certain ways. Argue against one of Hume's particular views on the improvability or non-existence of the material world, or the unknowability or non-existence of the mind. That's fairly self-explanatory. So just think about, what don't you really think you have an awareness of yourself as a thinking subject, as Kant will later say? I remember in a graduate seminar, I made a case for ineffable me-ness. It's like I peer into my own soul and I find me. I don't find particular perceptions. Along with those perceptions, I think I have an experience of myself. And although myself is never with the perception, and it's not true that I only observe the perception. I observe myself having a perception, not just the perception itself. Seems to me anyway. That seems like when I introspect and think about my own experience, I seem to find myself there. I have a sense of self. I have a rational self-consciousness, as Locke talks about. Maybe your experience is different, so that could be something you could talk about. Do you have an experience of your own mind? Locke has his ideas of reflection, which talk about the mind's experience of its own operations, and it seems to me that I have that sort of experience. Hume says no, all you have is certain sensations, and you have no impression of yourself above and beyond those sensations. So is that true or not? Talk about that. His views on cause and effect, of course, and I think that would be enough for you to talk about. So maybe a little more discussion today about Hume, about his ideas, and starting next week we'll jump into Kant and talk about how Kant again dials back empiricism. He tries to steer this middle course between rationalism and empiricism, and comes up with a synthesis of the two views, where he tries to include the best of both worlds, the best of rationalism and the best of empiricism, avoid the absurd skeptical conclusions of Hume, while also avoiding the dogmatic rationalism and sort of non-empiricist, I think Kant would say somewhat naive views of Descartes. And what Kant says is that Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumbers. So Kant starts out as a rationalist, and then he reads Hume, and Hume sort of wakes him up, and he says, "Oh no, rationalism can't be right." But Hume seems kind of crazy too. There's got to be some other answer, and so he tries to combine the best of both theories. I'll say that Kant's style is a bit difficult to read, and so what I suggest is, read the sentence, read it again, try to get maybe a feel for things. Focus on the commentary afterwards. Maybe read the commentary after you've read what you read, and then go back and look at it again. Kant's German writer. German writers tend to have this sort of obtuse style. It's part of the time. But that stuff I read from Hume seemed pretty easy to follow, even though the language is a lot older. Kant not so much, and he uses sort of jargony terms, but he explains the terms. So that makes him much better than Hegel and Heidegger and Husserl and all these people that come after him who don't define terms or define them eccentric ways or vague ways. Hume, if nothing else, I think is clear. Kant, I think, is clear once you get used to his style and kind of figure out what he's about. Even though he's harder to read, I think if you really work at it, you'll get an idea of where he's going, and it's worthwhile. And I think on Monday, so we'll talk about Kant and maybe a little bit about the two competing schools of philosophy, analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. And generally speaking, analytic philosophy deals with concepts and logical analysis. It's I think the rightful heir of Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. It's about philosophy as a quest for truth and knowledge, and then you get this thing that comes out on the continent, the main continent of Europe, called continental philosophy. Sometimes also related to postmodern philosophy. I think it's best to see that as an outgrowth of continental philosophy, and it tends to be jargony and technical. It doesn't rigorously define concepts. These philosophers love to spin big theories, but aren't really concerned about verifying them or validating them or proving them. And they tend to be relativistic, tend not to be focused on, they tend to be iffy on the correspondence theory of truth, tend to be relativistic, and just really hard to make heads or tails of. And I think reading the Phenomenology of Spirit by Hegel or something by Heidegger, you read it and you're like, I have no idea what this means. And I think unlike Kant, you read Kant, and even though you might be confused, at the end of the day, if you work at it, I think there's something worthwhile there. Hegel and Heidegger, not so much. And interestingly, Kant is claimed by both schools. So Kant is claimed by the analytic philosophers because he has this very logical style. He defines his terms. He's very focused on language, and that the analytic philosophers think that language is very important. Plato thought language was very important. They do linguistic analysis of concepts to try to get in touch with reality. So that's the analytic tradition. But the continentalists claim him because he has some sort of, I guess you would say, he has some pseudo-relativistic concepts. He kind of gives up the quest for absolute truth about the world as it is in itself, and piercing the veil of appearances to get to the ultimate reality. But he also, I think, says that knowledge is possible. It's just sort of knowledge of appearances. and we should lower the bar of knowledge. And once we do that, we can say we have knowledge, just not knowledge of the world as it is in itself, but we can have knowledge of the world as we experience it, and sort of make some educated guesses about what the universe must be like in order for us to have the sorts of experiences we have. So that's Kant. And because he's German and living on the continent of Europe as opposed to in Britain or the United States, he's also claimed by the continental philosophers. Even though I think he fits better as an analytic philosopher. And unfortunately, it seems that he spawned these postmodern philosophers who just take a little bit of what he says and just go off in a crazy direction. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on Monday. So don't forget to post the forum. I'm reading, grading those. Feel free to send me a little message. Let's see what else. So I'll be back on Monday. Forms are still due Sunday before 11:55 p.m. And maybe read ahead a little bit. Have some extra time. Read ahead a little bit into Kant, who we'll be tackling on Monday. And that's it for now. Buenos noches from Chile. Buenas noches from Chile. And I will see you on Monday.